Good evening, Caribbean. Good evening to everyone who is joining us across the Caribbean region. This is the edition of War on Humanity, hosted by UIC Jamaica. And tonight on this panel is myself, Fred Corbin, Dr. Michael Harvey, and Lady Carrie Ann Walker. And we would like to welcome all of our viewers on this Saturday evening on the 29th of June, 2024. So join us for a live discussion, and also where we're going to be exploring the context of civil disobedience in relation to how we are responding to our unification efforts for the Caribbean region and beyond. So, Lady Carrie, could you lead us off in this, giving us a description of civil disobedience and where we fit in with regard to our efforts in being able to encourage our citizens to look at this in the context of how we have been exploring and how we've been handling ourselves in the last 2.5 years of this scamdemic.
Mhm. Yes, I did get a chance to look up the act of civil disobedience, and according to Britannia, civil disobedience is the refusal to obey the demands and the commands of a government or an occupying power without resorting to violence or active measures of opposition. It's usually its usual purpose is to force concession from the government or occupying power. So it goes on to say that civil disobedience has been a major tactic and a philosophy of nationalist movements in Africa and in India, in the American civil rights movement, and of labor and anti-war and other social movements in our many countries. So there's lots to understand in terms of civil disobedience. One of the question one must ask um, is why would someone consider an act or to engage in an act of civil disobedience in the first place? Anyone
Well,
has?
to lead off in the direction of why would one want to engage in civil disobedience, I think we take a look in history at the what took place in India under Mahatma Gandhi when he encouraged 1 million Indians to just down tools and stop working, and they all sat on the beach and did absolutely nothing for 2.5 days. And the British government was completely and totally incensed. Not a single shot was fired. They tried to get people to coerce them back to work and so on, but the entire commerce section of that particular city just came to a grinding halt because here was 1 million people sitting on the ground just refusing to do anything. It was the greatest example of nationalistic authority ever displayed for the so-called British Empire to get down their necks. Okay, they had to really swallow their pride and realize, you know what, it's over. These people are not going to be compliant any longer. And in that context, I think that that particular action has been used by historians and has been used across the world as an example. And we're using it tonight as just an example. But what we also have to realize is that that worked for India at that particular point in time. What happened in India then cannot be duplicated in today's world. And the reason I say that is this. Number one, not only have our economies in the context of labor as well as the authority over the workforce has changed because everybody is working to make ends meet.
Mhm.
And in a country, and particularly a small island developing states like Barbados and Jamaica and the rest of the Caribbean islands, we have an independence of thinking that does not promote unity. And the reason for that is that everybody is thinking about where the next dollar is coming from and where the next meal is coming from, and their children having to be supported, and the fear of losing their jobs, and so on. This is what causes the destruction of the unification factor. So civil disobedience doesn't always work in small developing states like what we have in the Caribbean. However, civil disobedience can take the form of persons making a unified decision not to comply with certain regulations, such as not signing up for a digital ID, not taking a vaccine, not following a government regulation by having their cars licensed on time. That is all classified as civil disobedience. Whereas the civil disobedience that the example was drawn in India was the physical mobilization of 1 million persons to block the ability of the economy to operate in that particular city at that particular point in time. I'm not saying that it cannot be done here, but the problem that we have is that fracturing of unity because of personal interests and the disenfranchisement and the polarization of what we believe is going to affect us negatively. We have this attitude in the Caribbean region that, oh, civil disobedience is not something I want to do because everybody will think that I'm a deviant. I'm not going to be I'm not going to be accepted in my social circles, because very cleverly the cabal has made us so dependent on convenience and social interaction that we're afraid of losing our social status among our friends. So civil disobedience becomes something that we actually frown on. Oh, you're not supposed to do that. It mustn't happen that way. There are there are other ways to do this, and we have been encouraged and by the so-called church to run into the church and pray that what we want to happen will happen, not realizing that the churches are only a building. But if we exercise the faith of social disobedience or civil disobedience, and we actually ally that with the spiritual power of prayer, we bring together one very important thing. And that is we create a unification of consciousness that drives the unity of bodies.
Okay.
If we're not united in consciousness, where our conscience is actually speaking for what is right, we
Hmm.
cannot expect to mobilize physically.
Okay, Dr. Harvey, do you have something to say on the act of civil disobedience according to Britannia? What we went through is that civil disobedience is the act of, I suppose, disobeying the commands of a government when there's unlawful commands and lawful request of its citizens. What do you have to
Well,
say to
that's the
that?
advantage of what we're doing right now tonight. We're getting the ball rolling. And
Hmm.
before we can have any type of civil disobedience manifest, we got to get people's heads into it and get their creative imaginations into it, because there isn't
Right.
just one way to skin a cat, as they say. And we, on an
Hmm.
individual, have to think individually here, because as soon as we unite, they infiltrate or they do worse to us. The one thing they can't handle is
Hmm.
eight sovereigns laughing at them. So we have to, whatever we're going to do, we have to do it on our own. But the important thing about what we're doing tonight is getting
Hmm.
people thinking about the fact that the plan are going to be on this planet a whole hour. They're coming after us. Look how many millions of chickens have already been culled. They're killing our food supply in
Hmm.
the name of another scam bird flu. And the sheep are just going to go bah, and they're just going to keep buying into this and rolling up their sleeves until the population of this planet has been halved. And they're still going to blame the bird flu, because that's the problem. Now, we have to get people to wake up from the brainwashing and say, oh my God, they're getting ready to kill us. I got to do something.
Right. So one of the things that I've noticed is that this ultimate behavior of government unethical demand of its citizens comes ever so often in history, and citizens tend to at some point reach their breaking point, and naturally they decide to do something. However, what we're seeing as of lately, especially in the last season when we went through what I'm not allowed to say on YouTube due to censorship. We went through recent events and activities that really, I would say, was detrimental to our citizens globally. But yet, there's only a minority of us that are stepping up, that are preparing to do something. I know that in history, it usually tends to be the minority, but what will it take? We have so many who have passed on, who have been injured from the substance. What will it take today for our citizens to move into a new direction of, as you mentioned just now, they're now looking at coming up with additional threats and demands. They're attacking the animals. They're going after. One of the things that they're doing is their psyop operations of mind control, constantly telling you something is happening, something is happening. But our citizens seems to be asleep on a global scale. They're not ready to be awakened. What will it take to get them to be jerked out of this deep sleep state, per se? What are some of the things that we can
We
do,
have
those of
to
us who
start,
are awakened?
we
Go
have to
ahead.
start talking now to more people and get more people to realize what we have already realized, that we're under siege. And then one person gets the next person to see it, and they get the next person, and it kind of becomes like Amway. And after a while, people are starting to figure it out. And the objective is to get to a point of critical mass. Now, we would discourage ourselves if we expect that 8 billion people are going to get their stuff together to stand up for
Mm,
this. They won't.
mm,
They're unable to. They're not even going to
mm,
read or even know until it's too late and they're in a landfill somewhere. So we got to reach the people. You know, there's nothing stronger than preservation. We get people to realize that we're targets for elimination. We're going to cause some serious problems for the people. There are people out there who will do things that you and I would never do.
mm,
And do we even dare say they're the ones we're counting on?
mm. Sir, one of my curiosity about this whole civil disobedience is the definition that I'm running into is that civil disobedience has to come in the form of nonviolence. And I'm wondering and I'm curious, based on, again, historical context, is nonviolence always the best approach, or are we being directed not to be so interruptive through the acts of certain disobedience? Like we have currently in Kenya a group of citizens who started out being nonviolent in their stance against their government, but now has resorted to an act of violence. Does the act of nonviolent versus violence speed up the conversation with the government, per se?
Yes. Remember, they control us with fear. Until we start
Mhm,
controlling them with fear, they're just going to keep pouring it on. Now, they're human just like us. They have the same
mhm,
fears and worries and concerns as we do. Hey, what have
right.
they done a real good job of getting into our heads, right? What are
Mhm,
we doing to start to get their heads? There's a lot more of us, and they feel pretty insulated against us because they're back. So maybe it's time we start so-called leaders
at
and
one,
this all out.
so
You're
your microphone again. Well, we'll work on Dr. Arvy's microphone, but I'll
Are
turn to
you hearing me?
Fred. Yes, now I'm hearing you. You're back. So you were
I'm
saying
not hearing
earlier that
it.
perhaps
Cutting in and
it's
out a little bit. Are
time.
you guys hearing me okay?
Yeah, yeah, we're hearing you clearly.
Oh, good, good, good. Now I want to
Yeah,
back up and hear what you were saying. You were asking me something.
right. So you were saying that perhaps it's time to consider other means outside of the I didn't quite understand you fully. Were you saying that perhaps nonviolent is also a tactic that protesters can use in certain demonstration against their government, or is it violent an
Yeah.
alternative solution as well?
Well, we're not even supposed to say it, right? But look, you see what's happening
Right.
in Kenya. Don't you think those
Hmm.
governments that the people are only, and if you get enough that our survival is threatened, we don't have to
Hmm.
encourage certain people. There's so many parts per million theory. We just have
Right.
to get enough people aware that we're targeted, and we can sit back and watch it on television.
Right. Because to me, and perhaps Mr. Fred could answer this, to me, the act of imposing a medical intervention on a citizen come under a form of violence. So is it that the very same government who is acting violently towards a citizen is now turning and requesting that the citizens be acting in a, because we're not encouraging a violent revolution, but at what point, my question is, at what point is it safe for citizens to consider a bit more aggression in their tactic over the act of obedient civil disobedience through nonviolent tactics? At what point do we say our government is not understanding the language of obedience? Because all we do in society as citizens is obey all forms of laws. But the more we are in compliance with these laws, it seems that the more laws are piled on us. And the very government who are imposing these laws are never satisfied, but their act is always in grievance and aggression towards the citizens. When you impose, many people could have passed on, many people could have been injured from the recent impositions of government. I would say that's an act of violence. Why would a government then ask a citizen to be nonviolent in response?
Well, to answer your question
Exactly.
quite,
And we need to start having direct communication with certain government officials, like deciding who we want to speak with. Here in Jamaica, maybe somebody should call not Prime Minister, Health Minister Tufton, and just get into his head a little bit, right? And what we want these health officials, we want them to realize there are people out here who are taking their violent actions very seriously, and we're aware of what's going. We are the BDs without ever throwing a stone. We can win this. But they're people just like us. We got to scare them a little bit. We got to let them know, hey, we know what you're doing. You think you're going to get away with this? Let's see what you got, because you're not going to pull this off. You're going to have a fate that you're going to have to stop it right now, because the people are getting angry.
Sir Fred, you needed to respond to that previous question.
well, um, what we have to look at, there are many different and many variables in this equation. Number one, the historical context in which I previously outlined, where what happened in India with the million Indians, that happened, well over 100 years ago. The world has moved into a more violent and a more less tolerant situation overall in today's world. And when we look at the way that the corporation of government
Mhm.
has violently suppressed the will of the people, the peaceful will of the people, this has led to the overarching growth of mistrust by populations of their respective governments.
Right.
And the problem that we have in the Caribbean, as our good friend Dr. David Mohammed in Trinidad has often said, we are constantly promoting the image of democracy by waving our flags and running down the road behind the trucks and so on election day and voting for popularity rather than righteous context. Now, when you have a government that takes upon itself to impose the measures that have been imposed during the last escapade of this so-called scamdemic, every single one of the measures that they took was an act of violence against a population without the actual use of a violent action to implement it. But what it caused was a disassociation and a mistrust of government, which led to violent action in communities. So communities now started to turn on themselves because you had the definition of vaccinated and unvaccinated, and that created a division. And instantly you had violence break out because someone walked into a building without a mask on and was violently set upon by persons who believed he should be wearing one. So violence still comes into the equation, whether or not the situation is under control of government or left to the citizens to decide what they should do. And when we look carefully at what happened in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, one of the most important things that we can draw from that dark period of our history is that you cannot comply your way out of tyranny. And this was very, very clearly demonstrated during the Second World War before the Communist bloc was formed. This was very clearly demonstrated by the Czechoslovakian commander-in-chief of the Czech Second Army, General František Moravec. And General Moravec actually planned and executed the assassination of Heinrich, a German general in Czechoslovakia. And the SS General Heinrich was assassinated because of what had taken place in Czechoslovakia and the murder of over 1,100 innocent civilians in reprisal for an assassination attempt on a previous German general. And that particular assassination, when he was questioned about it after the Second World War, he said, "We never sought violence of assassination, but when your country is overrun by tyranny, there is no choice." Now, I'm not saying that we should take General Moravec at his word. Definitely not. We should avoid any form of that at all costs. However, what that did to society was that it showed society as far back as then, 86 years ago, that the intolerance of government violence against civilians is something that has boundaries. When a government takes upon itself, whether it be by actual force, kinetic force with guns, or whether it is by medical regulation to take action against citizens in order to force compliance, that is when the unification of the consciousness of our people needs to come into full view. And we need to exercise that consciousness in being able to enforce our position as the sovereign nationals of our territories and say, we are not doing that. And when we arrive at that point, the government or the crew in charge or whoever is in charge will more than likely do exactly what the president of Kenya just did. He mobilized the military against innocent civilians. What has just happened in Kenya is the complete beginning and destruction of the Westminster system of government in that country. And what you will see happen in Kenya in the very near future, probably the next 2 weeks or a month, is the rising up of a sovereignty movement within Kenya. And the current government of Kenya that is propped up by the British government and MI6 and the United States government and so on will fall. There will be a coup d'etat in Kenya, and Kenya will be free once more. And Kenya will join Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger as one of the other African countries now claiming its sovereignty. And that is what we want to see here in the Caribbean region. There are a lot of lessons that we can learn about civil disobedience and the rising of consciousness of our African brothers and sisters and bring it here to the Caribbean region. We can do the same. We are empowered because our history is inextricably linked to our African ancestry. My ancestry comes from Ireland, but I have black ancestry in my family as well. My great great grandmother was a black freed slave. Just because I have white skin doesn't mean that I don't have black ancestry. The most important thing to understand is that we are one people. We are one Caribbean.
Absolutely.
We
And
are
I,
standing. We are standing on the threshold. We are
right.
standing on the threshold of our regional sovereignty, but our consciousness is not there yet. And we have to raise our consciousness of recognition. We have to recognize who we are and claim who we are by raising
And
our consciousness at that level.
I must say this, if we haven't learned anything, if we haven't learned anything in recent event, we must learn this, and that is that we were all attacked. It doesn't matter what our colors, our creed, our religious belief, we were all fighting the same battle. And this is what
Mhm.
I'm here to get, especially the Jamaican or the Caribbean audience to be aware of, is that this battle, it's a war, and humanity, as we described in our subheadings and our subject matter, we are at war, and our government has declared war on its citizens around the world. Now I'm going to make a comparison to when I went. I'm one that had suffered from domestic violence. I've gone through a physical abuse relationship. And when I was going through the experience of the government imposing mandate, I felt eerily similar to being in a domestic abusive relationship. I felt that the government was taking on a direct form of abuse that resembles that of a domestic violence. And if you look at it a bit more closely, you would say, in fact, we were all domestically abused by not our spouses, not our partners, but our government. Because that was the feeling I experienced. I felt very weighed in. And so that's an act of violence. So I don't want to get away from the conversation about nonviolence, because preferably I think nonviolent is the best alternative. But it seems that the prevailers of democracies are those who are violating the very laws of the democracy. The government, who is asking for protesters and citizens, civilians, to always follow the laws, always be nonviolent in their protest. They themselves are not respecting the very request that they're asking of the citizens. And that's why, for me, at the very least, the conversation on the threat to escalate a nonviolent protest into potentially having conversation around, I wouldn't encourage citizens to go out and be violent, because you have to understand exactly what tools and measures you're using in order to escalate any confrontation with any government. But at some point, we must consider the possibility of escalation, because those who are imposing a tactic of fear, it's one of the most cowardly approach to take on anyone. It doesn't matter whether you're a parent, a spouse, or the government. When you put a person at risk for fearing their livelihood, fearing for their lives, fearing at all, where should we, the citizens, see it as an assault in the way that abusers assault their partners? Do we have the right to defend ourselves in that regard? And what method do we use? One of the ways we can do so with nonviolence tactic, the very simplest act of disobedience, nonviolently is simply defiant. The act of saying no is a very powerful tool. For me, that's where it starts. That's what I did when I was confronted by my workplace, when I was confronted by the government that I must impose something. I've suffered the consequences. I have had to lose all that I've worked for in order to say no to an imposition, something that was unwelcoming to me. I asked my workplace, I said, when I put this in my body and I leave and I go home to work, do I still take that intervention with me? Do I have the right to remove it after I complete my job? You could not give me an answer on that. So, no, I cannot do that. So, that act of defiance, yes, I lost everything, but I have my safety, I have my security. I also want accountability. I'm still waiting for accountability because I should not have lost what I lost because I said no. That's so when you're losing in the in a democracy, what is the definition of democracy in a society that imposes a violent act? Because in Canada, I understand that medical intervention is a physical intervention. You're the doctor, Dr. Arby. Do you say that a medical intervention is a physical intervention? Is it an act of bodily invasion of some sort?
Yes, it is. And of course, I'm a doctor of chiropractic. I don't do any invasion, no needles. We are a drugless healing
Right,
profession. But
right,
yeah, when you're injecting them with something, and we know from all of these products that have been injected into people for decades, an awful lot of recipients, they have side effects. People have to assert their right to say no. And I'm telling you, we've got to basis. We have to find a way to put fear into the hearts of the people doing this. You can do a lot just with words.
absolutely.
Words don't make
Right.
any holes, they don't cause any
Hmm.
blood. So you can do a number on people. I mean, you can lay down suppressive fire with a word processor. You can put some ideas in people's heads. Well, you got to wake these people up to realize, hey, they're catching on to us. And the thing is, most of the people doing this, you think these are just here, these public, you think they really have any idea they're murdering the population?
They don't care.
Gosh, medicine has become a religion in the rest of these belief systems that have sucked us in since we were too young to be able to evaluate anything on our own. It's time to break away from all the you know what they put in our heads to control us with belief. Belief has always been the trap for the human race. There's only one God. He's not up there, and I say he sure as hell isn't in church. He's right inside of you. Stay home on Sundays and Saturdays. God's within and he isn't anywhere else. So let him out and let these people know and let them see the power of God in each and every one of us. They want a belief system, give them some of this. You
Sir,
know, nothing's going to change until people get riled up, okay? We don't, and for next week's program, I'm going to say you something incredible. Many of you may remember where he
so we're
comes
having trouble
on to do
again.
the 6 o'clock news. He's been out in the
Sir,
rain.
you're cutting
You
out
having
on us
hearing me
again.
again?
You're cutting. No, you're cutting out. It depends on how you shift. I think
Uh,
in some settings we can hear, in other settings we
all
can.
right. So I'm going to try to stay still.
Right. But
This darn laptop, I'm just going to have to get a cam and put it into my PC, and maybe that's going to solve the problem. But let me know if you're hearing me, because I want to
I'm
relate
hearing you
something that
quite
will
clear
really
now.
inspire everyone. Can you?
Yes, please go
All
ahead,
right. I'm going to try
sir.
not to move too much. I
Right.
was referencing the movie Network, 1976, and Peter
Mm-hmm.
Finch's brilliant
Woodwork.
soliloquy that won him the Best Actor award. Is still hearing
Mm-hmm.
me good and clear?
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
And so he comes on to do the 6 o'clock news. and he's all disheveled. He's been out in the rainstorm. His hair's all messed up. He's had an extra drink at the bar, and he comes on and he says, "Listen, I can't tell you what to do. Got all the violence and the crime and the hurricanes and the poverty and the starvation." He says, "First, I can tell you this. First, you've got to get mad." He says, "You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it, my life has value." And he gets everybody in the whole nation to go to the window and open it up, stick their heads out, and I'm as mad going to take this anymore. It's time, Jamaica and Caribbean. It's our time to go to the window.
Hmm. Yes,
Well,
there's.
I'm going to
All right, go ahead, sir.
I'm going to second Dr. Harvey on going to the window,
Hmm.
because that's precisely what some of us have done in going to the window. And I was motivated to go to the window on the 18th of August 2021 and deliver the evidence to the public, to the absolute consternation of the manipulating controllers and the government. They did not expect to be ambushed. And we have to continue to ambush the government at every single step. I've ambushed the government in Barbados 3 times already, and they fell for it every single time because they are so steeped in their own belief system that they do not understand what is happening. And when you can ambush people continually on a with monotonous regularity, you drive
Hmm.
them to silence. And this is one of the reasons why the government in Barbados and the doctors in Barbados and the government officials in Barbados have never been able to challenge me on anything I've ever said, because every single time they open their mouth, I can ambush them with truth, knowledge, and education. What we have to understand is that we must bring the understanding of truth, knowledge, and education to each and every one of our sovereign nationals.
Hmm.
Everyone needs to become a truth bearer, a knowledge bearer, and an educator. This is our mission, because the best form of civil disobedience can only be adhered to when we understand that the government is a provocateur. They are the ones provoking us, but we can meet them on an equal footing with the ammunition of truth, knowledge, and education. And every single person needs to understand that they can be a truth bearer, they can be a knowledge bearer, and they can be an educator. All we need to do is to unite on the conscious level. Consciousness is absolutely essential. It's like having a door and it has 10 locks, and
But
one key fits all the locks. And that one key is consciousness. When you insert consciousness and you turn it, you get education. When you insert the key of consciousness into knowledge and you turn it,
mhm.
you get truth. And when you insert the key of consciousness into truth, you get education and knowledge. This is
I,
very, very important. Very
I want
important
to.
for us to understand.
I wanted to touch on exactly what you're saying, because it seems that the few that stood up against the government around the world, they were able to do the work of spreading the truth, spreading the facts. They were very successful, and then they were seen as a threat. So in response, we see government around the world moving into a very new space where they are now censoring speech. They are now in Canada, where I'm presently residing. I know that our prime minister, one of our crime minister, I should say, more or less, of this whole debacle, Justin Trudeau, I have no fear mentioning his name. He now comes up with the Bill C-63, and that is to censor free speech. Canadians are now looking at 25 years in prison for speaking freely. And this is all coming from the fact that we had the truckers movement. We have a movement in Canada, and we have a movement in the United States. We have a movement in England, and all the Western countries where citizens are now speaking truth to their governments, truth to each other, facts that is making the very prevailers of democracy uncomfortable because what works best for these entities are lies. And so I agree to what you're saying, that the truth is a very powerful weapon. But now we're looking at government creating law. And this is why I want us to really concentrate more on the subject of civil disobedience, because once again, our bodies were attacked, but now we're moving into a space where our ability to speak is now under attack. And our unfortunately, our Caribbean citizens are not fully involved in this conversation. They're not even aware, which makes them at more risk for these type of attacks. So,
But what we have to understand that is happening with the censorship that is going on in Canada
You're reading,
as well as here in the Caribbean. Here in the
you
Caribbean,
know, Jamaica's
we have a bill, we have a cybercrime bill that is being tabled by the by the government here in Barbados, where anyone who is deemed to be spreading misinformation or something like that can be fined $70,000 or 7 years in jail. Well, by definition, the bill itself is in violation of its own protocol because you were using a computer to carry out censorship illegally of your population. So, by definition, the bill is null and void of its own volition, simply because you are setting the example of assaulting the privacy of your citizens using the very tool by which you are trying to introduce a regulation. And remember, a corporate government, a corporation government, can only issue policy and regulation. It cannot make any laws because laws
that's
have to be made in sovereignty. So the entire censorship program is actually a psyop. It is known as DDT, disinformation, disenfranchisement, and trashing. So what happens is that they get someone who is actually speaking the truth and they spread disinformation about that person saying, oh, he's not this and he's not that and he can't say this and he can't say that, because the disenfranchisement then kicks in because of something he may have done in the past and so on and so forth. And then they trash that person on the media. So it's called disinformation, disenfranchisement, and trashing. And that's what they engage in. And the PSYOP is the cybercrime bills that they put in place are a PSYOP operation. They are psychologically empowered to take the citizens out of the equation, create a fear-mongering scheme around the entire thing, and disenfranchise and trash the ability of citizens to speak for themselves. That is what this is. And we have to understand what it is. If we don't understand that this is a PSYOP operation as part of the overarching PSYOP operation, and we understand, if we don't understand what DDT is, the disinformation, disenfranchisement, and trashing, then we fall victim once more to the fear of saying truth, knowledge, and education, and we completely comply with the government regulation and we follow the policy. We must ditch the policy, ditch the regulation, and call it out for what it is. It is a government psyop called disinformation, disenfranchisement, and trashing. And once we align ourselves with a conscious recognition of what that actually is, we drive a hammer blow straight into the heart of what the government is trying to achieve against us. Again, an act of violence that the government is trying to portray against innocent population trying to figure out what is going on. And remember, everything that you see happening in the Caribbean is happening in lockstep compliance to the Communist Manifesto of 1963, sorry. Communist Manifesto of 1963, where the disenfranchising and the demoralization of the population is the number one priority. So if you can create psychological operations that confuse the population so dramatically that they become demoralized, you can now mold them like clay and have them do whatever you wish, simply because they are living in a state of fear. And I quote Bertrand Russell at the end of 1945. He says,
Hmm.
any nation or any government that can instill a sense of great fear will always have control of the people. And that is the ultimate goal here, is to keep a population in fear of consequences. The only thing we need to fear, or the
It's
only
fear
person we need to
itself.
fear, is God himself.
Yeah,
Because
fear
our
itself.
heavenly Father never created a spirit of fear. I said that in my radio program this morning. Our
Hmm.
heavenly Father never created a spirit of fear. We
But
don't
so,
fear men.
or more or less, the fair is there as a protector, not to
Mhm,
be exploited, because we respond to our environment when something is threatening us. We immediately respond with fear. So it's a natural human emotion that we're possessed, we're innately, but there are those among us who exploit that
mhm.
emotion to their benefit, to their gain. But Dr. Michael, you wanted to intervene earlier. You had something to add? Are you frozen?
Yes, well,
What?
just this week, a Gleaner. I don't know if you get a chance to look at the Gleaner from up there in Canada. Just this week,
Hmm.
our Prime Minister, Aho Ness, said he's going to go after people on social media for disinformation. I have two
Right.
words for you, Mr. Holness. So look, we're on the right track here. We people have got to wake up, and that means getting angry. Because until you get riled up, you can't get coiled up and strike like a cobra. And it's time, people, to
Right.
get coiled.
Hmm. Yeah. It sounds like so far, from my observation, it seems that people are doing a great job, and this is why the government is now feeling very threatened, and
Mhm.
this is why they're responding with the tactics of and one of they are the great disinformationists. They promote disinformation in every sense of the way, but yet they're on the attack for disinformation, which is very inappropriate. I think our government, we have to now as citizens start to really question, what is a government? Is the government there to serve the people? Because so far, what are the examples of our government, in especially in recent time? What examples are they demonstrating that they have the people's interest? And I want to touch upon why it's imperative and essential that we start looking at new approaches to government. And I believe that UIC, this is why I've become a member of UIC, has that vision of an appropriate government tactic where citizens are in charge. Because what do they say? They say that when government, I think somebody may correct me on this, but when the government is afraid of the people, then we have what? Good governance. But when the people are afraid of the government, we have a dictatorship. And right now, we're having our citizens being threatened with prison and fines, extraordinary fines. The government has um, capitalized on the system of governance and are using it as an attack on its citizens. So, do we live in a democracy? Because you cannot have it both ways. You cannot proclaim to be, um, you cannot converse that freedom of, you cannot stamp on freedom of speech and speak of democracy, because that's um, one of the fundamental rights to democracy is to have one's ability to say things without being threatened with imprisonment and fines. We have a government that is currently willing to put people away for 25 years because they're not comfortable with what individuals are saying. We have also so many violations on civil rights coming directly from the branch of government. We really need to take a look at what we consider as good governance and perhaps move away from our political affiliates, our political diehard affiliates, and change, because without the people saying no, without the people making that choice to do something differently, we're going to unfortunately have the same chaos.
Well, I totally agree with you there, Lady Carey. And the most important thing that we have to understand is, and I think the problem here, particularly across the Caribbean and in the wider world, is that people do not understand the meaning and the context of democracy. And if we took the time to understand the word democracy, then we would think differently. Okay? Because the word democracy is made up of two words. The Greek words demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power. So, in other words, it's people power. But do the people have the power? Yes, they do. The people have the power. But are we using that power to empower democracy in action? If you cannot put democracy into action because the system of maritime control has taken control of the minds and the consciousness of your sovereign nationals, you have a position where nothing that you say actually will lead people to exercise their people power. So you cannot say that you are going to be preaching democracy if you do not have the power or the will to bring that empowerment to your people. And this is where the consciousness comes in. I keep speaking about the consciousness because if you are unconscious of the meaning of the words in which you wish to use, then that means that you're only using the word democracy as a playlist or a little heading that you like to say about things, or it's undemocratic, or it's
Yeah,
it's this or it's that, or democracy is this or democracy. You don't understand democracy simply
because
because if you understood democracy, if the people understood the democracy and the consciousness with which the power lies with them, we
mhm.
wouldn't be having this conversation.
But we have been taught incorrectly about democracy, it seems. We've been taught incorrectly about,
Mhm.
because I wanted to ask, in history, when we look at protest or civil disobedience, active civil disobedience, do we have comparisons of the effectiveness of both? Do we have, when we look at, for instance, the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King, was that an effective movement? Did we accomplish much in the civil right nonviolent approach to civil disobedience? At what point? Because from what I'm seeing in my historical facts, oftentimes, just like the Kenyan protests, it resorts to an act of violence before the people are heard by the government. So it all often starts off um, as a nonviolent protest. When I look at, and oftentimes the act of violence are often inflicted by the very government. So the people, the citizens, I've seen it with the whole COVID ensemble across Europe, in France, in Australia. I've seen that the citizens have been at peace in their protest, at peace in their non civil disobedience, but the government themselves are guilty of interrupting these protesters per se with acts of violence. So again, this is why I'm provoking this conversation tonight. Is that I'm hearing a lot
There's
about.
a
Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Harvey. You wanted to
all
say
right, and I'll
something,
get right
Dr.
back to it.
Harvey?
Sorry to interrupt, but there's a merge of nonviolence with
Hmm.
violence, a merge where you don't necessarily have to cause any injury to any people. There's
Right,
people over in England who are set with 5G towers. They're not
right.
what they put in the deadly injections. There's easier,
Hmm.
even
Apparently, doctor, we're not allowed
Tucker
to use
Carlson,
that
it blew
word
my
because we
mind.
got a
He was on
strike.
the Joe Rogan show,
Right,
and they can't listen to anything you're saying. They're not, their whole system is
right.
gone, and nobody has to get hurt.
Hmm. Well, I wanted to go back. It seems that this is a part of the government's PSYOP operation, is to convince the people not to defend themselves. People are always going to go back to the act of nonviolence because people want to protect their lives. People don't want to go out in the streets and be harmed or be injured because of a dispute with them and their governments. But once again, government officials in their capacities are attacking the citizens. I want to say that when you overtax your citizens, that's an emotional assault as well. So you are having forms of violence coming from our government. And the real act of physical violence I've observed in peaceful disobedient protest across the world, as in recent time with our COVID protest, or in the Kenyan, the government are themselves the one to retreat. So should people be prepared when they're going into the space of civil disobedience, that they might potentially have to get to a place where they have to defend themselves before they even consider being going through civil disobedience, or as I'm following the freedom movement, the best approach is to not confuse the two, because when you promote acts of violence, that's what I'm learning. A lot of people are against the consideration of violence in any type of protest or disobedience because it makes some people very uncomfortable and they don't want to participate. So the idea of even speaking about violence may turn one against the possibility of even wanting to engage in an act of disobedience. So it's an interesting conversation on both and but I guess looking at history, it seems that history do dictates that um, most protests, most acts of disobedience work in the form of nonviolence, but we must also be prepared to consider violence because our governments have often retreat or resort to violent acts or means to end the protest. And that should open the conversation again. We have to become more and more skeptical in our conversations and our attitudes and our feelings and emotions about government, because they're asking of its citizens one thing, but they themselves are committing the very crimes that they're asking their citizens to be in compliance with. So that's
I think one of the most outstanding examples of the where the government was acting as the provocateur and provoking acts of violence by the citizens was in the origins of the Arab Spring, which saw chaos reign across the Middle Eastern nations of Morocco, Tunisia, and all the way across to Syria. And while the background of starting this Arab Spring was based on a much deeper meaning, the origins of how it started was precisely the provocation of a government official on a on a particular citizen simply because the government official decided that what the citizen was doing was not in conforming or conformance with the regulation. And that happened in Tunisia in 2010 when a normal citizen, Mohammed Bouazizi, was selling fruit at his little corner stall on the side of a road where he would set up every morning, and a municipal inspector didn't like the fact that he was selling fruit there and decided to take upon himself to confiscate Mr. Mohammed's produce. And when Mr. Mohammed asked him why he was doing this, he slapped Mr. Mohammed in his face. And that one slap triggered an event that persons in Tunisia had never seen before. When Mr. Bouazizi then doused himself with gasoline and set himself on fire. And that sparked outrage and protests that spread right across the Middle East. Again, here is the government being the provocateur, okay, provocating an act of violence against an innocent citizen. That's all he's doing is selling his fruit, as he's done countless times before. What we have happening here in the Caribbean region is a continuation of the provocation. They're provoking citizens to violence, and we only have to look at what is happening in the region. Here in Barbados, we've had 3 homicides in 48 hours. Why? Because the government is provoking the people into frustration over economic circumstances, and there is now territorial warfare happening. Okay? And this is happening across the Caribbean region, not just Barbados. It's happening in every country across the Caribbean region, where gun violence has now risen to the point of epidemic proportions. Why? Because the government taxation and the implementation of this and that and so on is the provocation for this kind of action. And then the government is going to say, we have to control gun crime. So we're placing a moratorium on this, and we're going to be declaring martial law and so on and so forth in order for them to achieve their nefarious goals. Whereas we, as the sovereign nationals of our territories, need to understand that the government is on a provocation agenda. When you understand that the government is on a provocation agenda, we have to educate, we have to spread truth, we have to spread knowledge. We have to understand that the only way to beat provocation is by education. If you don't educate your citizens, if you don't educate your sovereign nationals, if you do not educate your sovereign nationals, if you do not bring the ability of raising their consciousness to the level that they do understand what the government is doing, the problem will continue to get worse and worse and worse until the government makes a decision that affects everyone negatively. And by then, it's too late.
So I just wanted to wrap things up. Unfortunately, we're coming to a close on tonight's event. And we just want to hear a little bit from our audience. Here we have a gentleman, Fire Burn. He's there's no questions, it seems, tonight so far, but what we have is a comment, several comments, in fact. Indeed, nonviolence would be the way. So our audience seems to prefer the act of nonviolence. And he gave the example that means that billions of dollars would affect the political parties when you look at perhaps economic boycotts. um that is a very effective, it seems like our audience is saying that's more a very effective way to approach civil disobedience
Mhm.
through perhaps restricting removing billions of dollars from the marketplace. And that's a very great suggestion, because I want to believe that when the truckers protest happened in Canada, it was the economic impact that seizes and get the government's response immediately.
Mhm.
I believe that the truckers who are responsible for hauling billions of dollars of goods and services throughout the country had virtually shut the country down by not going to work, and was willing to stay on the Capitol Hill for as long as it takes to get their voices heard. But once again, um, they weren't heard because we have a very immature leader. I know I have to be very careful on this platform, but his response to the truckers, as opposed to having a discussion, was to put the iron fist down with the Emergency Act. He pulled the stunt of totally violating what we consider democracy laws and freedom of speech by locking up and seizing their bank accounts. He did the ultimate violation of civil rights of the truckers. But yes, they were very effective in um, really impacting the economy, which affected the United States and the world economy. And Canada has not recovered since.
I
So,
totally agree with that. I totally agree with that.
mhm,
Canada has not recovered in the same way, but the good thing about the economic impact, as our commenter has said, and I agree completely with what was said with regard to removing the billions of dollars from the economy. One very simple way to cause serious harm to
mhm,
the government understanding, or to bring about a very severe message to the government, almost like a public service announcement, is for everyone that has a bank account to just suddenly close it and withdraw their money in cash. Go to the bank, take your money out in cash. Boom,
right.
done. If 30,000 people were to
Mhm,
turn up at the banks in Kingston, Jamaica tomorrow morning
mhm.
and withdraw all of their savings and take it home, the banks would then be giving the government pressure. Hang on a second, you got to do something about this.
And
Economic
how
economics.
right, and how effective would it be if we decided that everybody takes a day off work? No one goes to work for a day. We
Well,
could
the problem
totally
with the problem with that is this. The problem
we
with
have
that is
lives.
this. Yep. The problem with that is that, again, you're not going to get unification on that because everybody's
Right,
struggling for their last dollar. And the
right,
system has been designed to keep us separated and disenfranchised in that manner. Because
right,
what works for somebody who may have a bank account with a couple thousand in it is not going to work for the average man on the street selling coconuts, because he's dependent on selling 300 coconuts a day just to get $50. Okay, it's not going to work. So this talking about not going to work for a day does
yeah.
not work. It doesn't. Okay, it will never work. The most
Mhm,
effective way of dealing with the government and sending a very clear message to the government
mhm,
as a public
mhm,
service announcement
mhm.
is walk into the banks, close your bank accounts, move your money home. Bang, done.
Which
Simple.
which brings us to perhaps another topic to consider in the future, because now they're looking as a cashless society. I think
Mhm.
that's the way they want us to go, which is why they're bringing up their concept of the NID program, where everybody goes digital. So again, and the other thing that we have to look at is government insistent control over our lives. So those are the future subject that we may want to consider. But
Yeah.
we have also one other audience member who mentioned that one of their concerns are the agent provocateurs, that they feel that there are lots of people in our midst that we now have to be attentive to,
Mhm.
who are there not necessarily to so when we're talking about civil disobedience, I believe that came up a lot with the Black Lives Matter movement, where the government is now putting agents in the midst of protesters to provocate acts of violence, perhaps to redirect and to shift the movement. So again, when we consider nonviolent protests, we have all types of things to consider, because that was one of the things that happened in the last event of protest, where we're hearing and understanding that governments are now putting agent provocateurs among, and that's again is another violation, because
Mhm.
people do have the right to express their grievance when their officials are not, um our when their officials are not in alliance with the social contract, because the mere fact that they're in these positions is that we are in a social contract, an agreement that you're there and you were elected by the people to do the will of the people, not the other way around.
Well,
So,
I think it's very important to understand what you're saying as well. Is that the the ability and the the human right of freedom of assembly is an
mhm,
absolute must, and it must always be maintained. Because if you are willing to censor freedom of speech, that means that you have already taken the decision to disallow freedom of assembly. And
right,
we are experiencing that right here in Barbados, where there are a group of persons who like to hold marches of protest, but they have to pay the commissioner of police in order to be able to allow them to march. What
yeah,
sense does that make? You have already taken the decision to disallow freedom of assembly. That
mhm,
means that your censorship of freedom of speech is a foregone conclusion. Because by the very fact that we have freedom of assembly means that we are exercising our freedom of speech. So if you're going
mhm.
to pay the government to allow you to march, that means that you're complicit in their cybercrime bill to censor your freedom of speech. What is the point?
Unfortunately, unfortunately, gentlemen, we're running out of time. And so I just wanted to know if there's any last word from you both before we come to a close on this evening's session.
Go ahead, Dr. Harvey.
I think we I think we took another giant step forward tonight, like we've done each of the past couple of weeks. And I'm really
Hmm.
excited to be part of this for the next one. We got to take this to the next higher level. We got to get this out to as many people as possible. And the more people who wake up, if we don't wake up now, we're going to be asleep forever. Once people realize that, they're going to wake up.
And we're open to having important guests who share these interests to be a part of these conversations. So if anyone is aware of anyone who is interested in engaging on this platform about these type of dialogues, we're welcome to screen an individual for their input, because the more of us speak about these conversations, the more the word gets out. And one of the comments that I'm seeing reoccurring is that they feel people are unintelligent. But I'd like to think that it's not necessary that individuals are unintelligent and don't want to learn, is that they were misinformed, uninformed, was not given the proper knowledge. And we can see that happening because our school system have fallen so gravely, that they're not there to educate their population anymore, but rather to misinform their students into becoming obedient slaves.
Mhm.
So, and that I close on this note. Anything else before we go?
Well, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And I think the comments section has been, while small, has been immensely contributory to what we've been saying. And I would like to thank all of those who commented tonight. And please join us again next Saturday night, because we aim to continue this for as long as possible. And we would like to extend an invitation to anyone who would like to join us as a special guest if they think that they have something to add to the context in which we were talking about, and if they have a pertinent topic that they would like to discuss with us and the rest of the region who are listening. So thank you all very much for joining us tonight, and have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you both for joining on this conversation. I look forward to many more of these type of enriching and engaging topics. Thank you all for joining us on One Jamaica TV. Thank you again.
Good night, everybody.
Bye bye.
Good night.
Good night.